There's a moment, and I think you know this moment, when everything in you wants to react. Someone says something that cuts deep. A situation unfolds in the worst possible way. You're standing in the middle of an argument, or a disappointment, or a silence that feels like rejection. And something inside you rises up fast, defensive, sharp, ready. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's the urge to shut down completely. Maybe it's the impulse to prove you're right, or to make sure the other person knows exactly how much they've hurt you. And in that moment, right there, in the heat of it, a different question surfaces. Not, who's to blame? Not, how do I win this? But something quieter, something that almost feels out of place. What would love do now? I want to sit with that question today. Not as a spiritual concept, not as something abstract or idealistic, but as the most practical, most urgent question I know how to ask. Because I think most of us have been taught to believe that love is what you feel when everything is already going well, when people behave the way we want, when life cooperates, when we're safe. But what if love isn't a feeling that arrives when conditions are right? What if it's something you can choose, even now, even here, even in this? That's what I want to explore. Let me tell you how I used to think about love, and I suspect it might sound familiar. I thought love was something you earned, something you gave to people who deserved it, something you withheld, naturally, justifiably, when they didn't. If someone treated me well, I was warm. If someone disappointed me, I pulled back. That seemed not just normal, but right, reasonable, the only sane way to operate. And there was a logic to it, a very convincing logic. The logic goes like this: love is a resource. It's valuable. You don't hand it out carelessly. You protect it. You give it to people who appreciate it. You take it back when it's not reciprocated. You use it strategically, even if you'd never call it that. Under this logic, love is always conditional. It's a reward system. Behave well, receive warmth. Behave badly, receive distance. It feels like fairness. It feels like self-respect. But here's what I noticed, and this took me a long time to see clearly. Every time I made love conditional, I wasn't actually protecting myself. I was building a case. I was collecting evidence. I was keeping score, and the scorecard was exhausting. The vigilance required to maintain it, always watching, always measuring, always calculating who deserves what from me. It was quietly draining everything. And the strangest part? Even in moments when I won, when I successfully withdrew love from someone who hurt me, when I made my point clear, when I stood my ground, I didn't feel free. I felt tight, closed, armored. Because here's what the conditioned mind, what some traditions call the ego, actually believes about love. It believes love makes you vulnerable. It believes that to love without conditions is to be naive, to be a target, to be someone who gets taken advantage of. So the ego's answer to what would love do now is almost always, not yet, not until this is resolved, not until they apologize, not until things change, and that not yet can last for years, for decades, for a lifetime. I came across a body of spiritual teaching, A Course in Miracles, that completely dismantled this for me. Not gently, not slowly. It went straight to the foundation. It said something I wasn't ready to hear, that love is not a response to behavior. Love is what I am. And when I withhold it, I'm not protecting myself from someone else. I'm cutting myself off from my own nature. That landed like a quiet earthquake. Think about it this way. Have you ever been around someone who was genuinely, unconditionally loving, not in a naive way, not in a doormat way, but in a steady, clear way. Someone who didn't shrink in difficult moments, someone who could be honest and firm and still remain open. There's something unmistakable about that quality. It doesn't feel weak. It feels like the most solid thing in the room. That's not sentiment. That's not wishful thinking. That's a different relationship with love entirely. The teaching I'm drawing from makes a distinction I find essential. It separates love, which it describes as our deepest nature, always present, always available, from what I might call love with an agenda. Love that's actually fear in disguise. Love that says, I'll be warm to you as long as you make me feel safe. I'll be open as long as you don't trigger me. I'll give as long as I'm receiving. That version isn't love. It's a negotiation. And the negotiation always breaks down. Because the terms keep changing. Because what feels like enough today isn't enough tomorrow. Because you can never control enough variables to stay consistently safe. And so you can never consistently love. This is a good moment to mention. If this is landing for you, if you're finding something useful here, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this content reach more people who might need it. Now, the question becomes, if love is actually what I am, if it's not something I generate based on circumstances, but something I either allow or block, then what would love do now? Stops being a sentimental question. It becomes almost strategic, because in any given moment, I have two operating systems available. One runs on fear, on the need to protect, defend, control, and manage how things look. The other runs on something steadier, something that doesn't need the situation to change in order to respond with clarity. The Course calls these two voices, and I find this image useful, the voice of fear and the voice of love. Not dramatic, cosmic forces. Just two very different interpretations of what's happening and what's needed. The voice of fear says, this is dangerous. Protect yourself. React now. The voice of love says, what is actually needed here? Notice the difference. Fear reacts to the surface. Love responds to the depth. Here's where something shifts for me, and I want to offer it carefully because it's easy to misread. Choosing love doesn't mean choosing passivity. It doesn't mean smiling when you're hurting. It doesn't mean staying in situations that are harmful. It doesn't mean pretending conflict doesn't exist. I spent time confused about this. I thought being loving meant being agreeable. And then I watched what happened when I tried to be agreeable out of fear, out of the need to be liked or to avoid tension, while something in me was seething. That's not love. That's suppression, and it always surfaces. The turn happens when I realize the question, what would love do now? Is not asking me to perform warmth I don't feel. It's asking me to go beneath the reaction, to pause, even for 2 seconds, before I let fear make the decision for me. Let me give you a concrete example. Someone I trusted said something that felt like a betrayal. Not a dramatic one, a quiet one, the kind where you're not even sure you have the right to be upset, but you are. Deeply. My first instinct was to pull away, to go cold, to let the silence do what I wanted to say but couldn't. And then I asked, almost against my will, what would love do now? And love didn't say, pretend it didn't happen. Love didn't say, be sweet and overlook it. Love said, speak clearly, say what's true, stay in the room. That's the pivot. That's what changes. Because in that moment, love wasn't soft. It was honest. It was present. It didn't abandon the situation, and it didn't abandon the other person. but it also didn't abandon me. This is what I mean when I say love is the most practical question I know. It doesn't ask me to feel something I don't feel. It asks me to act from a deeper intelligence, one that isn't organized around self-protection. And every single time I've managed to access that, even partially, even imperfectly, something in the situation shifts. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle, but the quality of what happens changes. So how does this actually work in daily life? Because I'm not interested in spiritual ideas that stay in the realm of concept. I'm interested in what changes on an ordinary Tuesday. Here's what I've learned to do, not as a practice, not as a ritual, but as a habit of inquiry. When I notice I'm about to react, when I feel that familiar tightening in the chest, that heat, that urge to defend or withdraw, I've learned to pause long enough to ask one question. Not, what do I want to say? Not, how do I protect myself here? But, what would love do now? Sometimes the answer is silence. Real silence. Not the punishing kind, but the kind that gives space for something to breathe. Sometimes the answer is directness. Saying the thing I've been afraid to say, but saying it without venom. Without the goal of winning. Sometimes the answer is to walk away. Not out of anger, but because continuing the conversation in this state isn't serving anyone. And knowing the difference between those two kinds of leaving takes practice, but you learn it. Sometimes the answer is simply to stop rehearsing the argument in my head, to recognize that the conversation I'm having with myself, replaying what they said, perfecting my response, building my case, is costing me something I'm not willing to keep paying. Here's something I've noticed. When I ask, what would love do now? And I actually listen for the answer is almost never what fear told me it was going to be. Fear said, fight back or you'll be seen as weak. Love said, you don't need to prove anything here. Fear said, if you forgive this, they'll do it again. Love said, your peace isn't contingent on their behavior. Fear said, someone has to be wrong here, and it needs to not be you. Love said, what if being right matters less than staying connected? I'm not saying love always has easy answers. I'm saying it has clearer ones. And the more I practice asking, in traffic, in disagreements, in moments of self-judgment, in the middle of the night when I can't sleep because something is unresolved, the more natural it becomes. Not perfect. Natural. There's one more thing I want to say about application, and it's this. The question isn't only for situations involving other people. What would love do now? Direct it at yourself. When you've made a mistake and your instinct is to spiral into shame. When you've failed at something and the voice in your head is cataloging all the evidence that you're not enough. When you're exhausted and you can't figure out why nothing feels like it's working. What would love do now toward you? I think this is where most of us have the hardest time. We can imagine being loving toward others far more easily than we can imagine being loving toward ourselves. And yet the teaching I keep returning to is clear about this. You cannot genuinely extend what you do not first know yourself to have. This isn't selfishness. It's sequencing. You can't pour from a cup you've convinced yourself is empty. So we come back to the question, what would love do now? I want to offer you a different version of it, not a better one, just a wider one. Not, what would love do in a perfect situation? Not, what would love do when I'm feeling generous? But, what would love do now? In the middle of this, with these people, in this body, with this history, with this amount of patience I have left, in this exact moment of my life. because that's the only now there is. And I think most of us, if we're honest, already know the answer. We often know what love would do. We just don't trust it. We think it costs too much. We think it leaves us exposed. But here's what I've discovered. Slowly, imperfectly, in the ordinary moments of a very ordinary life, love doesn't cost more than fear. Love costs less. Fear is the one that drains everything. Fear is the one that keeps me up at night, keeps me rehearsing, keeps me armored and vigilant and exhausted. Love says, you can put the armor down, not because it's safe out there, because you are not what the armor is protecting. That's the shift. That's the whole thing, not a technique, not a formula. Just a question, sincere, repeated, practiced. What would love do now? And then, as honestly as I can, doing that. If you don't know A Course in Miracles, I could say that it is a treatise on love, and it teaches that. Only love is real. Thank you so much. See you in the next video.